recorded, so as you can hear. So if you have sort of problems with that, then please just keep your camera out and mute yourself, and feel free to send any questions you might have in the chat, such that you're not being recorded physically. So that's sort of housekeeping. Then I'm very glad to introduce to you Julian Reif, who's today's speaker. Julian is an associate professor of finance and economics at the University of Illinois. And he is also the PI of the Illinois Workplace Wellness Study. He's an applied microeconomics who's focused most on sort of determinants of health and also the value in health, working on pollution and working also on in particular this workplace wellness. And today he's going to talk about how habits form. I think it's also a study based on the Illinois Workplace Study, so we're very eager to learn more about this. He's happy to take questions as we go, so you can either put them in the chat, and Tina will keep an eye on the chat to and sort of introduce your question at an appropriate time. But Julian also mentioned that he would stop at certain times to allow you to ask questions, so feel free to engage with the topic at any time. So without further ado, we're very happy to have Julian, and please take it away.
All right, well, thanks so much for inviting me to present my research on habit formation using experimental evidence from health screenings. So this work is co-authored with Damon Jones and David Molitor. I would like to briefly acknowledge all of our generous funders for this project, and we hope that they're able to continue funding impactful research into the future. So in this paper, we are interested in studying habit formation, which is a topic of long-standing interest among economists. So for the purposes of today's talk, I'll be using the traditional Becker definition of a habit, which is a positive relationship between past and current consumption, or what an economist would call a complement. So while habits have been well studied theoretically, they can be difficult to identify empirically. So first and foremost, the researcher needs some way of distinguishing a habit from mere serial correlation in behavior. So for example, do I exercise every day because of an addiction caused by my prior behavior, or just because I like exercising every day? To distinguish between these two explanations, we need exogenous variation in my behavior. All right, so for example, if I exogenously increase my amount of exercise on Monday, do I exercise more on Tuesday? So a second, more difficult task is to characterize the underlying mechanism. For example, cigarette smoking is widely believed to be an addictive behavior, meaning that my cigarette consumption today depends more on how much I smoked yesterday than on how much I smoked last year. So this stands in contrast to, for example, a learning mechanism. All right, so for example, if I try mangoes for the first time and learn that I love them, I have now started a new mango eating habit. So in this case, my mango consumption today, my new habit, is causally related to the first time that I tried mangoes in the past, but otherwise is unrelated to additional mangoes that I later consume. So these two mechanisms, right, learning and addiction, are both examples of habit formation, right? They represent a positive relationship between past and current consumption, but they exhibit very different dynamics, right? Addictions can generate unstable binging behavior, things like that, while a simple learning model might have no real dynamics at all. And as I'll show you in today's presentation, it's possible to distinguish these two mechanisms, but it will require not just one, but multiple periods of exogenous variation. So our study aims to shed light on these important questions in the context of biometric health screenings using data from the Illinois Workplace Wellness Study. So this is a large-scale RCT that Damon, David, and I ran several years ago. So as part of that study, we paid about 3,300 university employees to participate in 3 years of health screenings, which included standard body measurements and a fingerstick blood test, among other things. We also have a second wave of about 1,500 employees who we paid to participate in 2 years of screenings. And as you'll see, that will be useful for replicating and validating some of our main findings. Now, all of our incentives were randomly assigned, so that allows us to cleanly identify the causal effect of past screening completion on current screenings. What's more unique in our setting is that we have multiple years of randomized incentive, and that allows us to investigate potential mechanisms. So, for example, we can estimate whether screening behavior in the 3rd year of our study depends more on 2nd year screenings, as would be predicted by an addiction model, or on screenings in the 1st year, as would be predicted by a learning model. And so here is a brief summary of what we find. So first, our financial incentives were quite effective. So they boosted screening completions by 20 to 70% over the different years of our study. Second, we document a strong habit formation effect from the 1st year screenings. So when we use our randomized incentives as instruments, we estimate that completing a screening for the first time raised future screening rates by 80 to 90%, so a very large effect. But in contrast, we find no evidence of habit formation coming from the 2nd screening. All right. So this overall pattern of results strongly rejects predictions from a standard addiction model and instead supports something more akin to a learning or an experience good model, right, where the subjects in our study learned about the demand for health screenings by experiencing those screenings for themselves. So we contribute to 2 main strands of literature. So the first is the very large literature on habit formation. So I'm citing just a few of the papers in this literature. There are so many papers in this literature. It's very large. Some of these papers estimate addiction models. Others attribute their estimates to an experience learning model or environmental cues model or something else. To my knowledge, all of these papers take their underlying mechanisms as given. Okay, so the main contribution of our paper, by contrast, is to empirically distinguish between some of these different mechanisms. And then we're also related to the growing literature on habit formation in health behaviors. So this literature has predominantly focused on high frequency activities like daily hand washing or weekly exercise. And so our main contribution to this literature is showing that habit formation can emerge even for low frequency activities like annual screenings. So that's sort of the brief summary of the paper. So for the rest of the talk today, what I'll do is I'll start by presenting some basic models to show you how you can empirically distinguish, say, addiction from a learning model. And then I'll talk a little bit about the background of our study and then move on to the results. But before I get into those details, I'll just, again, pause for a second in case there's any questions about where I'm going with the talk today. Okay, I don't see any questions. So I will move on then to talking about the models. So as I mentioned, our goal here is to distinguish between 2 common models of habit formation, addiction and what I'll call experiential learning, or sometimes called an experience good model. We're not trying to innovate on the modeling side here at all. My goal here with this section is just to be very explicit about what the predictions of these models are and how they differ. So the addiction framework that I'm going to present is based on the well-known rational addiction model of Becker and Murphy. For the experience good model, from what I can tell, there isn't a standard model of experience goods like there is for addiction, but the model that I'll present you is consistent with prior work on experience good models, which is done predominantly in the IO literature. Oftentimes those papers are using structural models to estimate habit formation. in consumer learning patterns. All right, so here is the setup for our addiction model. So for simplicity, we assume consumers are myopic. Although that's not important for any of our results, we make this assumption just to simplify the presentation of the math. So there is an addictive good A sold at a price P, and then a composite good C that we'll use as a numeraire. Consumers have a stock of past consumption that depreciates at some rate D. And then they maximize their utility subject to a standard budget constraint. Okay, so again, just a very standard setup here. To solve it, we will assume that utility is concave and quadratic, which is a standard assumption made in the addiction literature. And then we will consider a 3-period version of the model where the initial stock of past consumption is equal to 0. As I'll show you in a few slides, that exactly matches our empirical setting, which will consist of 3 screenings over 3 years of a new health screening program that was introduced at the university. So if you solve this model, you get equation 1, right? This is a very familiar equation for anybody who's worked with rational addiction models. And you can right away see a key prediction of this model, which is that consumption in the 3rd period depends more greatly on 2nd period consumption than on 1st period consumption. Okay, so in fact, if you set the depreciation rate equal to 1, which is an assumption made in several empirical studies of addiction, then you get an even stronger prediction that 3rd period demand will depend only on 2nd period consumption and not at all on 1st period consumption. Okay, so again, nothing new here. We're just making explicit what the standard predictions are from an addiction model. So here is the experience good model. So our setup is going to be exactly the same. The only difference is that we will assume a different form for the stock of past consumption. Okay, so the stock of past consumption will be equal to 1 if you've ever consumed the good in the past, else it's equal to 0. Okay, that's the only difference. So in this case, you'll get a different prediction. All right, specifically, only initial consumption will matter for habit formation, right? So in other words, the only way that you ever get a positive relationship between 2nd period consumption and 3rd period consumption here is if you didn't consume anything in the 1st period. Okay, so again, very different prediction here and a different kind of model. Okay, so again, just to summarize this, to make it very clear here, right? We have these 2 different habit formation mechanisms, right? They both predict a positive relationship between past consumption and current consumption, right? But the form is different. Okay, so in the addiction model, right, we have a form where we predict that the coefficient on 2nd period consumption is bigger than the coefficient on 1st period consumption. Okay, in the experiential learning model, okay, you get that there's only one effect. Okay, it's always the same, and it's only positive and non-zero when it's the first time that you've consumed the good in the past. Okay, and so we're going to essentially be able to estimate both of these models in a very simple reduced form way in our data to distinguish between these 2 mechanisms. So I'm going to pause here again just to see if there's any questions. This is all I'm going to say about the models before I turn to the background and the estimation.
I just have one sort of perhaps obvious question, but like, of course, the models are not mutually exclusive, right? At least.
Yes. Yes. So we're not going to come down and accept the experiential learning model. What I'm going to show you with our estimates is that we strongly reject this model, and I'm going to show you that our estimates are consistent with this model. But yes, this is a good point. You can imagine that there might be other models as well that would be consistent with what we have. We chose these 2 because they're the ones that we see most commonly discussed in the literature. if there is another model, especially one that can be easily fit with our data, I would be very eager to hear about them. I think the addiction one is obvious. This one is a little bit less obvious. But another model in principle could be consistent with this as well.
Yeah, and also like, could there be like a model in which there is this well, there's some sort of hybrid form in the sense that there's like the sort of the one-off experience, but then also some addiction element to it? Like, can there be some sort of hybrid version of the two?
So in principle, yes, it will come down to sort of how strong you think the addiction effect is potential. As soon as addiction becomes remotely strong, right, this effect here where theta 1 is bigger than theta 2 is going to end up dominating.
Right.
And so I think in general it's going to be difficult, but I agree. We're not ruling out other more complicated mechanisms or alternative ones. We're looking at these two because we think they're the most common ones in the literature.
But as you say, like any model that involves some addiction, you would expect this theta 1 to be larger than theta 2, which is not what you find, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, and I think we focus a lot on this in part because the rational addiction model is the one that's most well studied in the literature. Right. The theory is very well understood. The prediction is very clear. Other models are a little bit more ad hoc. So,
thanks.
Yeah, that's a good question. And any other questions about the models? Okay. Well, let me move on then to discuss our setting. So our study, the original design of the Illinois Workplace Wellness Study, right, was to understand the effects of workplace wellness programs. So let me tell you a little bit about them. So these programs are marketed as a way for firms to reduce their healthcare costs while improving health and productivity at the same time. These programs became really very popular over the last 10 to 20 years. The majority of large firms now offer them in some form or another. They're estimated to cover hundreds of millions of workers worldwide. So the exact structure of these programs varies, of course, from employer to employer, but they all tend to have at least some of the following three features. So the first is a biometric health screening. This is what we're going to be focused on today. So in these health screenings, you typically have a clinician who comes on site to the workplace and measures the health of your employees. So these measures can include blood pressure, height and weight, waist circumference. They often administer, as in our setting, a finger stick test, which measures your glucose levels, triglycerides, and cholesterol levels. The second component is a health risk assessment, or HRA. So this is a survey designed to assess lifestyle health behaviors such as exercise frequency and smoking habits. And the last is a set of wellness activities, and these can range from self-paced walking programs to stress management activities and more. So sort of the Cadillac or gold standard version of a wellness program will include all three of these components, along with financial incentives to encourage employee participation. It's also recommended that employers provide paid time off to complete these activities, some of which can take quite some time. Okay, and so all of these elements were in fact included in our study. So let me tell you a little bit more about the specifics of our setting. So the Illinois Workplace Wellness Study is a randomized controlled trial that we designed to better understand how and whether these wellness programs work. So the study itself ran for 2 years, from 2016 to 2018. Treatment in our setting included annual health screenings, a variety of wellness activities, and a large number of randomized financial incentives. So for today's talk, I'll be focusing on the 4,799 employees who were randomized to one of two different waves of the study. So the wave 1 group, which I may also refer to as the wellness group, this included 3,275 employees who were eligible to participate in the full workplace wellness program. Okay, so that included 3 annual health screenings in 2016, 2017, 2018, as well as the HRA and these wellness activities. The second wave included 1,524 employees, and they were not eligible to participate in the main program, so they couldn't participate in the wellness activities or these HRAs, but they were invited to complete health screenings in 2017 and in 2018 for purposes of comparison. Okay, so that was the original design of this study. So we've studied these subjects in prior work. So in a 2019 paper, we showed that among those Wave 1 employees who were invited to participate in the full program, the ones who were most eager to participate were already healthy to begin with. And then in a 2020 paper, we showed that the program had no detectable effects on health or medical utilization. So I think it's, there's a lot of groups here. I think it's easiest to see in figure form what is the basic design of our study. So I'll start with Wave 1. So in 2016, they were randomly assigned to one of 2 treatment groups. So the first one, the low incentive group, received $0 for completing a health screening. And then the high incentive group received either $100 or $200 for completing the screening. So we're going to be pooling together, these two groups. Okay. If the people in the Wave 1 group completed their health screening, then they were eligible to participate in the rest of the program, the HRA and the activities. Okay. Then in 2017, we randomly assigned a second set of financial incentives for completing another health screening. All right, so these incentives were completely re-randomized. Right, so on average, there's no correlation between the 2017 incentives and the 2016 incentives. Okay, and there's one more year of the wellness program. And then in 2018, this was the last time that we offered incentives for health screenings. This was the point at which we ran out of money, and so the study ended. Wave 2 had a similar setup. So they weren't allowed to participate in 2016, but in 2017 and 2018, they were offered randomly assigned incentives in exactly the same way as the Wave 1 individuals. Okay. Unlike the Wave 1 individuals, right, the Wave 2 individuals were not invited to participate in other parts of the workplace wellness program. Okay, so Wave 2 participated only in the screenings, right? They weren't able to do the other downstream activities. Okay. So all in all here, you can see that essentially we have 5 different experiments. Okay, we have 3 randomized assignments in Wave 1, and then we have 2 randomized assignments in Wave 2. And this setup allows us to test for habit formation. Okay, so for example, for the Wave 1 subjects, we can see, does the 2016 incentive, right, have any long-run effects on screening behavior in 2017 or 2018? Okay, if it does, as I'll show you, we will interpret that as evidence of habit formation. Okay, so this is the basic experimental design. It's pretty clean because everything is randomized. But before I turn to the results, let me again pause for a second just to make sure that the general setup is clear here. We have 2 waves, Wave 1 and Wave 2, and we have 3 years of screenings for Wave 1, and then 2 years of screenings for Wave 2.
I have again one clarifying question on so why were the Wave 2 sort of participants not eligible in the first wave? But like what is special about this group?
So the reason is because in the original study, they served as a control group for Wave 1. So the original study, we wanted to estimate the effect of the workplace wellness program on these individuals, and Wave 2 served as a control because they did nothing in the first year. We invited them to do screenings because we did have to measure their biometric outcomes in order to do the comparison. And so that's why they were invited here. But they didn't participate in anything else because they were treated as a control group.
I see.
Any other questions? Okay. well, let me move on then to our results. So one of the nice things about our setup is that you'll be able to see our main results looking just at the raw means. So I'm going to start with our just raw means first, and then we'll move on to regressions and other stuff. So here are the screening participation rates for the wave 1 group, shown separately for those who were assigned high incentives in 2016 versus low incentives in 2016. Okay. So we can see a clear direct effect of the incentive. So in 2016, right, about 49% of people assigned to the low incentive group completed a health screening, and this rises to 62% for the high incentive group, right? So this is just the very, unsurprising result that people will show up to stuff if you pay them for it, right? The next set of bars shows the effects of this 2016 incentive, right, on participation rates 1 year and 2 years later. And we can see here that these incentives did produce long-lasting effects, indicating habit formation. Okay, so remember, the 2016 incentive, this is all relative to the 2016 incentive, it depends only on participating in 2016. There is no extra incentive for these individuals to complete screenings in 2017 or 2018. Okay, but nevertheless, they did. So for example, if we look in 2018, 38% of people who were assigned the high incentive in 2016 completed a screening, right? This compares to just 33.8% of people from the low incentive group in 2016. Okay, so we can see there's a persistent effect of this first incentive. And then we can repeat this with the 2017 incentive, because in 2017, there was a second incentive. It was completely re-randomized, but we re-randomized and assigned everybody a high and low incentive in 2017. You again see a large direct effect, right? Participation rises from 33 to 53 percentage points if you were assigned the high incentive in 2017. But now we don't see any detectable effect of this second incentive on participation in 2018. Okay, and this is basically our whole paper in one figure. Okay, so the first incentive does have long-run effects. Both of these differences here are statistically significant. The second incentive that we offered in 2017 does not have a detectable effect on participation 1 year later. Right. Everything else is going to be sort of converting this into something that's understandable using IV and so on. But this really is the main result in the raw data. You can see it just in these means. Okay. So for completeness, we can repeat this or essentially replicate this estimate with our wave 2 group. Okay, now the wave 2 group, we only have 2 years of screenings. But again, you can see here in 2017, which for this group was their first time receiving an incentive, there was again a very large direct effect of the incentive. It boosted participation from 25 to 53%. And this was followed by a significant persistence effect 1 year later. All right, so this is again consistent with our result that the first incentive matters for habit formation. Okay. So those were our results, just showing you them in raw means. We can confirm this and get a little bit more precision using regression analysis. So the outcome variable here is an indicator equal to 1 if the individual completed a screening and 0 otherwise. So we will just regress this on the full set of screening incentives. For today, the tables I'm going to show you don't include any control variables except for just the, here there's just no control variables at all. In our paper, we've also chosen controls optimally using lasso. It has basically no effect on our results. So those are just available in our appendix. So here are the results. I'm sorry for showing you a table with so many numbers. Let me walk you through this. So the numbers on the diagonal here, which are shaded in gray, all report the direct effect of the incentives. So for example, in column 1, the 2016 incentive raised participation in 2016 by 12.4 percentage points, right? Relative to an overall mean of 58%. Okay, so you can see all of the direct effects are very large. Again, that's exactly what we would expect, right? People show up in the year that you pay them for completing a screening. If you look at the lower diagonals here, these are falsification tests, essentially, right? So you can see that the 2017 and 2018 incentive had no effect on 2016 participation. So that, again, makes total sense. People did not know what this, these incentives are completely unrelated to anything in the past. What we really care about are the numbers in the upper diagonal here, which are shown in bold, okay? And you can see here, again, the clear pattern that the first incentive matters the most. So if we look at wave one, okay, we can see that the first incentive in 2016 increased participation significantly in the 2 years that followed, okay? If you look at the second incentive given to this wave, you'll see that there was no persistence effect, okay? It was small and statistically insignificant. And then if we look at wave two, we again see that this first incentive produced a persistence effect 1 year later. Okay, now unfortunately in wave two, we only have 2 years of data, so we can't look at the persistence effect of the second incentive. Okay, but overall here again, the fact that the first incentive matters most indicates that the habit formation effect we were picking up is consistent with an experience good model, but not an addiction model. All right, and I'm going to now show that to you more formally using an IV analysis. All right, and so what we will do here is regress current screening rates on past screening rates. And of course, these are endogenous variables, but we can instrument for them using our randomly assigned financial incentive. So the key identifying assumption here is that incentives affect future participation solely by raising current participation. All right. And so this equation is, in fact, exactly the addiction demand equation I showed you earlier, right? So we're going to have third period consumption here regressed on second and first period consumption, essentially. Okay. So when we estimate this equation for wave one, using all 3 years of data, we can directly test the prediction from the addiction model that the third year screening should be affected more by the second year screenings than the first year screenings. Okay, so just a very clean mapping there from this equation to the model. And then here are those IV results. Okay, so if you look across the first row, you can see that completing the first screening always raises future screenings. It's large and statistically significant. So if we want to interpret this in column one, right? So completing the first screening raised screening rates in the second year by 36 percentage points, or about 80%. All right, so this is a substantial habit formation effect. So we can estimate the effect of the first screening on the second screening or the third screening for wave one, or we could estimate the effect of it on the second screening for wave two. I'm going to focus here on column two, because this makes use of all 3 years of our data, and is going to map exactly onto the addiction model, okay? And you can see here, right, we clearly reject the addiction model. The addiction model predicts that theta 2 would be bigger than theta 1, right? But we find the opposite. Right? The first screening has a major effect on third-year screenings, but the second one has no detectable effect, all right? So these, the confidence intervals on this exclude this point estimate, and vice versa. You can also pool all these and reject this point estimate with quite a bit of statistical power, okay? And so we have a clean rejection here of the addiction model. All right, so let me again pause for a second in case there's any questions about this result before I start talking about some robustness checks and so on.
Hans, you had a question.
Yeah, so I'm just still trying to sort of make sense of the full set of results. Can you go back to the initial sort of descriptive sort of the bar plots, let's say.
Oh, yes. These,
So I guess I have two questions on this. Like one is like why do you see sort of the sort of just the take up of these screenings going down over time, also in the control group?
yes. That's just because participation rates were declining overall with time. So that was just that's just a secular trend in the data. And some of this is due to attrition. So the university has about 10% turnover per year. And of course, if you leave the university, you can't participate in the program anymore. So some of it is just a mechanical effect of attrition.
I see. So those are the zeros also. Yeah, I see.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's right.
And then the second question I had is like one thing I don't fully. I mean, I think you sort of show very convincing evidence that sort of the second incentive is less effective than the first one. I think that's very convincing. But one thing that still puzzles me a little bit is that so are you saying that the effect of the second incentive is sort of less strong because people already have some experience in the first year? Like what is like you would expect there to be some sort of people who sort of do not take up the screening if they don't get an incentive, but they like the compliers basically. So there are some compliers in the second stage, like in the second sort of the second year basically. And so I'm just puzzled why you don't see any effect in the third year. You know, like that it's smaller. I think that's very clear and also in line with your story. But I'm just puzzled, like why you don't see any effect, let's say, in the third year among the ones that first received the incentive in the second year.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I'll speak to it directly in a few slides. The short answer is that there's not many people that did not participate in the first year who also participated in the second year. But you're right, there are some. And in fact, right, you may see, there is, this is close to zero, but it is positive here. And some of that is what you're picking up there. To really pick it up, what you want to do is condition on not having participated in the first year, and we're going to do exactly that in just a couple slides here.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree with your comment.
And if I can then maybe add a question, if you can go back to the bar charts.
Yes.
Do you have an explanation for why the second year screening incentive appears to have so much greater of a direct effect than the first, especially because on average the amount is lower? And that then also, begs the question, like, because you have two prices in the first screening incentive, and the way I read your regressions, you're just using the incentive as a dummy. So whether you got an incentive or not, but how would you interpret differential effects or similar effects, whether people got $200 or $100 as an incentive in the first year?
Yeah, so you can look at it separately. As you would expect, people who received $200 were even more, it had a greater effect than $100. But it turns out it doesn't give us enough additional power. So we don't bother separating those instruments out, but you could run this with more instruments than what we have by partialing those out. In terms of trying to compare across the different years, it is tricky in part because of what you just said. Like comparing these numbers is hard because the incentive amounts are changing over time. And so we actually don't really like to compare these magnitudes directly, precisely for that reason. Much cleaner is the IV analysis, right? So the IV analysis allows you to sort of now directly compare these effects. And you can see here that once you've essentially scaled them to account for the effect of the incentive on screenings, you can see that the estimates, in fact, are very similar across all of these. So the effect of the habit formation effect of the first incentive on the second screening for wave one, you can't reject that this is the same as the effect of the first incentive on the second screening for wave two. So we think, in fact, that these effects are all quite similar. It's just seeing it in the reduced form is close to impossible, really, because of the differing amounts over the years.
But this is all effects that you're showing in the regression on lagged screening. But then there's a substantial difference in terms of the direct effect, right?
Yes, so the direct effects are also different. So for example, let's see, yeah. So if you look at the direct effects across here, right, these are, they range from 12% to 28%. right? Now, some of that is because of differences in amounts, right? So the amounts ranged from, you know, $200 to $75. Some of it is also just differences across, you know, some, you know, statistical noise across the years,
Mhm.
right?
Okay, great.
So I
Yes.
think it's a combination of those things.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, there's one more question. I think Davide.
Yes. So if I may interrupt, so it looks. So you were mentioning the models, no, rational addiction model. I was thinking that actually what you are showing resembles a habituation process, which actually the past negatively affects the marginal utility today. No, so if I had pizza yesterday, I don't want to have it today because somehow I'm temporarily satiated. And this might also provide an additional alternative explanation theoretically to the ones you had. Just wanted to add this, which may be.
Yeah, I agree, right? So it's not obvious that you would have complementarity across these years. I agree completely. Like I think your prior might be the opposite. That you say, well, I got a screening in the first year, now I don't need it for 5 years, and it would have a negative effect. I think that's perfectly plausible from a theoretical perspective. As you can see here, we're finding that there are positive effects. So we think that that's not going on, but that could have been going on, and that is something that we could have found. Of course, going into this, we weren't sure what it would be. So I agree with that. Good point. Okay. Any other questions? Let's see how I'm doing on time. Okay. Yeah, I think we're fine here. Okay. So let me talk briefly about the exclusion restriction. So it's always important in IB analysis to think about that. The main concern we have is the possibility of payment confusion. So for example, maybe some people assigned to the high incentive group in 2016 mistakenly thought they would receive high incentives again in 2017, even though they were re-randomized to the low incentive group and told their incentive would be low. So if that happened, we would find persistence effects, but the exclusion restriction would be violated. Okay, it would just the persistence was coming just because people were confused. A nice feature of our study design is that we can actually investigate this possibility because we have multiple years of data. So specifically what we can do is focus on the subsample of people who were assigned a high incentive in 2016 and then a low incentive in 2017. So for these people, even if they were confused in 2017 and thought they would get a high incentive that year, right? They presumably learned their lesson when they were paid a low amount. And with our design, we can then look to see if they still exhibited persistence in 2018. And here are the results of that subsample analysis. So columns 1 and 3 here reproduce our original estimates obtained using the full sample. And then columns 2 and 4 subset down to these individuals who received a $0 incentive in 2017. You can see here that our estimates look very similar. And so we don't think that payment confusion was driving any of our results. And then, so finally, and this is sort of turning to the question that Hans brought up, right? So if it's not habit formation, if it's not addiction that's driving our habit formation, then what is causing it? And of course, we don't know for sure. You can't accept a model, but we think a plausible alternative model is something like the experience good model that I outlined for you earlier. Okay, so the idea here is that there is some uncertainty among people regarding their demand for screenings. And then when they are induced into a screening by the incentive, they learn that they value the information that they got from the screening or that they enjoy the experience. And so they decide to continue getting future screenings. Right? And so as we saw earlier, this would imply a demand function where screenings today depend on screenings in the past only if it was the first initial screening. And so you get here technically this slightly different demand function, right? Where we have to condition the regressors on whether the person was ever screened before, right? So this was Hans's point, right? That, oh, you know, technically, right, we should maybe see some positive effects of the second screening if you had some people who didn't participate in the first year. And so we're going to now look at that possibility directly All right, so we have to change our estimating equation a little bit. We're going to condition this second regressor on not having participated in the first year. Okay, and so we can do that. Here are the results. So unfortunately, we don't have a lot of power because as I mentioned before to Hans, right, we don't have many people who chose not to participate in the first year, but then decide to participate in the second year. Okay, so there's not too many people that did that, and so we get some noise. That said, for what it's worth, we cannot reject the equality of these two estimates, which means that our findings are consistent with an experience good model, right? And so overall, the addiction model is very cleanly and strongly rejected. Okay, the experience good model, by contrast, remains consistent with our estimates. Okay. And so I'll sort of wrap things up around there and then sort of open it up again for more questions or discussion. But overall, what we found in our study is evidence of very strong long-term habit formation in annual health screenings, okay, over a period of at least 2 years. So we reject addiction as a mechanism. It seems more likely that the pattern of habit formation that we found is produced by something like an experience good model. And so the last thing I'll mention is just a few of the policy implications of these findings. So first, the fact that it is only the very first incentive that produces habit formation means that you should front load the incentives, right? So the front loaded or first incentives are those that are most likely to be the most cost effective, right? Incentives that are offered later on are not going to produce habit formation, and so they will be less cost effective than the initial incentives. The second thing I'll mention is that our habit formation effect is very large. So if you do the calculations, habit formation in our setting raises the cost effectiveness of the initial incentive by over 70%, right? Or over 20 percentage points, right? So to the extent that the habit formation results that we find generalize to other settings, like public health vaccination campaigns, they suggest that those campaigns may be a lot more cost effective than has previously been recognized. All right, even when you're talking about something that only happens once a year, there can be large habit formation effects from inducing people to engage in that activity. So I think I'll end there. I think we have a few minutes left, and as I mentioned, I'm happy to talk more about anything else in this paper or whatever people are interested in. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. I think Elisa has a question. Do you have a question?
Yes, I do. Thank you very much, Julian. Super interesting presentation. I was just wondering, and also based on these policy implications, of course, as a contribution, you also have that this particular health behavior is very low frequency, it's annual behavior. So I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on this basically interplay between these two types of models or these two types of theories on more high frequency behavior? Would you expect the same thing happening there, or yeah, just interested?
Yeah, I think it's, that's a good question. I think it will depend a lot on the setting. I think the most convincing evidence on, say, rational addiction is there's a very nice paper on daily hand washing, and I think it was in Bangladesh, I believe, from several years ago, and that was looking at the daily level. They had estimates that were clearly consistent with a rational addiction model. The problem in a lot of these papers is that when you only have 2 periods of data, you can't rule out other possibilities. And actually, you will see this sometimes. For example, in this daily hand washing paper by Hussam et al., they mention, in fact, that it's possible that there could be a learning thing going on in that setting. They can't rule it out. They think it's unlikely just because of their knowledge of the institution, but they can't show it empirically. So I mean, my prior is that both of these, matter. I think smoking is almost certainly addictive. But I think that the takeaway here is if you actually want to rule out one of the other mechanisms, you are going to need, in most cases, multiple periods of data with exogenous variation. So that's what's difficult here. So we can do it in our setting because we have 2 periods of lagged consumption and strong instruments for both of those lagged consumption measures. Okay, but that's what you need to roll it out. If we only had one, I would be presenting a paper where I showed you there's habit formation. We found that the first screening raised second screenings. And then I would just speculate about, well, I think it's addiction maybe, or I think it's some other thing, but we wouldn't be able to say anything empirically about it. So I think the main thing is to try to use a research design that can actually rule out one of the mechanisms or the other. But in terms of which ones I think are present in the real world, I suspect both are. I'd be surprised if that wasn't the case.
Interesting. Thank you.
I was still wondering, Julian, about sort of was there any sort of relationship between the screening and this risk assessment, or were they completely independent?
So you mean the sort of the activities that people did?
Yeah. Like you mentioned there's these 3 parts, right? Yeah.
Yeah, these 3 parts. Yeah. And so they are going to all be highly correlated because you had to do the screening in our setting. You had to complete the screening in order to do these other activities.
Right.
And so you could also consider alternative specifications that look at effects on those as well. So yeah, you're going to see those embedded in here too.
And sort of what are the implications then for like external validity? Like, did people already have in mind sort of the entire package as opposed to just screening?
Yeah. So that's a very good question. We wondered about that a lot ourselves. What for us, we don't think that in fact these other 2 activities matter for our habit formation findings because of the presence of the second wave. So the second wave is a cleaner test of only health screenings. There's none of these other activities going on, right? And as you saw, we found estimates that were very similar. And so we don't think that, for example, really what was driving people showing up in this year was some sort of confounding with activities going on here or whatnot. Those activities were not present at all in wave 2. So we don't think they matter for this.
Right, thanks.
I have one question, Julian, that's maybe just, which I don't think you can separate in your study. It's more about the literature, this learning literature in general. Are people trying to separate learning that is, because I could see the learning coming from 2 different things. Learning that comes from you learning about your own cost benefit analysis of this, of taking part in this. And then there's learning that is, okay, there's learning that makes it less costly for me to participate next year because I know where to park. It's going to take me less time because I know where to go. It's, it's an easier process. So that's a little bit different theoretically than changing based on the information that you have. And do people in this learning literature try to separate that or?
Yeah, so first, I think both of the explanations you offered are very possible. We've thought both of those could be at play here. As you pointed out, we can't distinguish what it is that you're learning. So is it, you're just experiencing that you learn that you like it, or that you like the information, or that you've learned now, oh, now I know how to go and sign up for an appointment and so on. Any of those could be driving this in our setting. In terms of the other papers, I certainly haven't seen anyone identify it in a sort of a clean, non-parametric reduced form way. What happens in some of these papers is you assume sort of a structural model for the learning, and you kind of try to estimate some of the parameters of that is typically the way those kind of papers operate. So I don't think they've been able to distinguish between what you're suggesting. Although to be fair, I may be missing a paper or 2 that has done that. If anybody knows of a paper that's done that, certainly we would be very interested in seeing it.
I mean, it would be interesting in the future to tease that out, since you're getting such a strong learning story here, to try to understand the learning that's going on, I would think. So it's, yeah. Because
I
it
agree,
is
yeah.
quite a clear story that you're getting, yeah.
Yeah, there's always more mechanisms under the mechanism.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. I think, Davide, did you have a question?
Yes. So if I may contribute, I think there are two possible things that you may want to consider related to Tina. Somehow she's referring to the extensive margin. So we can imagine that first is the choice of whether one wants to participate. And therefore, if you know how to park and where to park, this reduces the fixed cost, the entry cost. And once you decide to be there to participate, then how much or how intensely you exercise or you participate to the program. So that would be the intensive margin. Now, for the extensive margin, you can take into account this reduction in fixed costs for participation, as Tina was mentioning. For the intensive margin, I think probably there might be some confusion on the terms, on the terminology, because the literature uses a lot habit formation, addiction, learning, learning by doing, learning by consuming, satiation. So it's all somehow complicated. And it might even be the case that for your paper on health, talking about addiction might be somehow slippery. And so I was thinking that an alternative could be that, in a sense, for the intensive margin, where the marginal incentives matter, so marginal utility, you might have two potentially alternative hypotheses. One is this one, say, learning by doing, learning by consuming, reinforcement. Becker and Murphy call it now reinforcement, this positive cross derivative of past consumption on current behavior, which means that if you get an incentive, you start smoking or exercising, and then over time you build a habit, you more and more smoke or consume. And this is what you do not get. You also have the opposite, actually. If the cross derivative is negative, if I pay you to go to the gym, you go to the gym, but then the following day you are tired, you are satiated somehow, and so you exercise a bit less. So you will get a big shock at the beginning, a sort of surprise effect, kind of, and then eventually a less response. Still positive, but less response. So this seems more along the lines of the experience model you said. But in principle, you might model them within the same model. And what you somehow might be testing is this cross derivative. With Nicolas Zibert, we have a paper on this. If you look, sorry for the self promotion, but in that one exactly, we look at what happens when there is a shock, and then depending on how the response in the medium term, actually, you may disentangle whether you are in case A or case B. In that paper, exactly to avoid this confusion with the macroeconomic literature uses habit with the opposite connotation with respect to what you do. So they say, if you consumed in the past, you don't want to consume today. So to avoid that confusion, for example, in that paper, we call it taste formation, or you discover your preferences, and the other satiation. Just I had pizza yesterday, I don't want to have pizza today. Or I do want it, but a bit less, not so much. So that might be useful. Also, it might be useful to be careful on the terminology, because then people get confused and everyone is thinking about, addiction is bad. And yes, Becker and Murphy talk about beneficial addiction, but it's always a bit slippery.
Sorry,
Yeah.
we do only have 1 minute left of this webinar, and just to make sure we are on time, I'm going to ask to wrap it up. So if we can possibly just do our closing remarks, and we'll finish it off there.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I'll just sort of add a little bit to Davide's point. One is that so I think if we were to do some structural work here, I think we could also glean a little more insight perhaps into a more sophisticated model here that could look into some of these possibilities. In terms of the terminology, I wholeheartedly agree. Like, reading all the habit formation papers, it's very confusing. They definitely do not all assume the same thing. One of the things that we're trying to do in this paper is to make everything very clear. So, for example, the long-run effects of a financial incentive, we call that persistence. It's not habit formation unless you're willing to impose an exclusion restriction. that the incentive operates through past consumption, right? And then habit formation itself, we try to make it very clear that that is just the causal effect of past consumption or current consumption. It can be any model you want. So habit formation is not the same as addiction. Addiction is a specific mechanism, right, that produces habit formation. And so we try to be clear about that in our paper. And we hope that maybe it might be useful to other people also who, I think it's very confusing going through all these papers. There's different definitions that conflict with each other.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Julian, for this very interesting and engaging presentation and discussion. It was super interesting, so thanks a lot. So to the rest, we'll pick up again next month on the 7th of April with Anne Caring from the University of Chicago presenting. So I hope to see you all there and enjoy the rest of the week. Cheers.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Julian.
Take care.